Hello and welcome to Threads of Fate. I'm your host, Kira Ryberg, and I am so excited to be here with our first official episode. If you didn't check out the intro, this is going to be a podcast all about astrology, divination, and the threads of fate that weave throughout all of our lives. And honestly, what better way to start off a podcast titled Threads of Fate than talking about fate, right? Because fate is one of those things that exists in all of astrology, sometimes in more obvious ways and sometimes in less obvious ways, but it also is just a force in our lives, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. And I feel like it's one of those things that holds a lot of tension for people. And I think it can actually be a barrier to going deeper into the astrological tradition and craft because it feels like your agency is being taken away in some way, shape, or form. And I think people struggle with that notion a lot. And so I kind of wanted to peel back the layers, go back to the very beginning, talk about fate in the context of astrology, outside of the context of astrology, and really just kind of gain a deeper understanding of what fate really is and why it's something that I find comforting instead of something that I find fear inducing. So, what is fate and what is free will, right? Because that is really at the heart of this age old controversy and discussion amongst astrologers, philosophers, and just people in general, right? So, fate comes from the Latin word fatum, which means that which has been spoken. And I think about that as almost like this oral decree, right? It is the things that are almost declared in a context that you are now required to experience this, right? We can think about it in a more modern day context of that which has been written, right? So it's these things that are immovable. It is the laws of nature and order that we are kind of all subject to in some way, shape, or form, right? It is what will come to pass. And so, in this context of fate, if you're thinking about this outside of an astrological framework, we are all subject to fate. We don't choose the families that we're born into. We don't choose the country that we're born into. We don't choose the culture or the dominant religion or the major events that we are subject to experience in a given lifetime, right? Those are things that fall outside of the realm of our control. And ultimately, that's what fate is getting to the heart of. It is the stuff that we don't get a say in. It's the stuff that we are just kind of bound to experience for some reason or another. And when we're thinking about this outside of the astrological context, this makes a lot of sense, right? I don't think anybody would argue that someone who's born into poverty in a third world country is going to have vastly different circumstances, opportunities, and the like versus someone who's born into a wealthy family in Los Angeles, let's say, right? So we are already kind of running up against the confines of our fate based on the situations that kind of happen to us and surround our birth, right? So we already are kind of recognizing the fact that there are things that we cannot control. If you are driving on the freeway and someone comes in and rear ends you and you get into an accident, right? You didn't control that. That was something that happened to you. And so that is also a working of fate, right? And we tend to think about fate in this very negative way, right? In the context of like an accident or a car crash or something like that. But fate can also be a force of good. For fate can be very positive too, right? Like getting just happening to be in the right place at the right time with the right person that lands you the job that kind of helps your entire career take off. That is also something that we could say is subject to fate, right? Subject to chance, to circumstance. And it doesn't always mean good or bad. It's neutral. Like fate is a neutral concept, which I think is something that needs to be reframed in our ways of working with and acknowledging this force in our lives is that fate is not out to get you, right? It is just what is. And I often think about it as almost like the roll of a dice, right? Sometimes you're going to roll double sixes. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're going to luck into certain opportunities and circumstances. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're born into really privileged circumstances and sometimes you're not. And the idea that we have control over these things is just completely antithetical to our lived experience, right? No one chooses to get cancer. No one chooses to get sick. No one chooses to experience grief or death, at least for the most part, right? These are things that befall us. And I think that when we think about that in that way, it can be kind of hard to accept that, oh, maybe I'm just I'm just meant to experience some bad things in life. But isn't that the nature of life itself? I don't think anybody listening to this podcast or anybody in the world would ever say everything has always been good. And I've never been subject to an experience that fell outside of my control that was, that was bad. Right. Like everyone goes through shit, and fate kind of points us in the direction of what that shit is going to be, for better or for worse. Right. I'm talking about it more in that negative context. But like we just said, there are ways in which that this can be positive. And if we think back to kind of that etymology of fate, that which has been spoken or which has been written for you, then these are the things that you are just inclined to experience. Now, when we think about fate inside of astrology, right, it's inherent to an astrological practice and framework for interfacing with reality. If you quote unquote believe in astrology, which you don't need to believe in astrology, astrology is working all the time, right? It's not necessarily a belief system. But anyway, I digress. If you are operating under the astrological framework, you automatically are admitting that there are forces of fate at work, right? Because a birth chart, being born into a certain place at a certain time, is going to predispose you to experiencing certain types of events, certain types of people. And even if you're coming from a more modern framework, like a modern astrological framework, and you kind of believe that the chart is really just a reflection of your internal world and your psyche, this is still valid because you're saying that some people born at a certain time are going to be expressing themselves in these ways, that they're going to be navigating these internal challenges, that this is kind of the mapping of their soul, right? And that being different from another person's inherently means that there is fate at play. And so within that context, we start to see how you can't really do astrology if you don't believe in fate or you don't think fate is a force that we are subject to in this world. And I really think that when we go back to traditional astrology, the kind of astrology I practice, Hellenistic astrology, right? This was the dominant belief during the time that most of these texts were written. Stoicism in particular kind of came up around 300 BCE due to this guy named Zeno, who was like this philosopher. And a main tenet of Stoicism was to accept your fate so you can live in harmony and live a less kind of tumultuous life internally, because you're not going to be so upset when something bad happens if you know it's going to happen, right? I will say that's not always true as an astrologer, right? Sometimes you can see something bad coming, you can see a transit that looks a little nasty. That doesn't prevent the pain of that experience from happening, but you can develop greater acceptance around the fact that it's not always going to be good. And I think this is one of the major issues that we have in society is that we are taught that we should always be progressing and productive and winning and successful and moving up the ladder. But no other species on Earth operates according to that mindset or principle, right? I say this all of the time, but every inhale has an exhale, every sunrise has a sunset. Every turn of the wheel of fate that brings you up will also bring you back down again. And the more that we can kind of feel into that and accept that, the greater our internal harmony is going to be, because there is a release of the expectation that we should always be at the top of our game, which I think can really lead us to this perspective of I'm failing or everything's bad. It's all my fault. Like sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes shit just sucks, and that's okay. It's not normal for things to be good all of the time. And if they were good all of the time, you wouldn't appreciate it because that would just be your baseline experience of life. And wouldn't that be great? Yes, but there would be no differentiation between good and bad, positive and negative, right? Because the baseline is different. And when we think about this in our modern world, right, it's so important that we kind of take this expectation of progress and perfection and cast it so far to the side so we can develop greater self-acceptance for the fact that we just can't always be doing our best. And we can try our best, but sometimes life is going to get you down. Sometimes there's just going to be things that you cannot avoid, and that is okay. you know? And I think that the Stoics were kind of onto something with that. Is like if you can develop acceptance of the good and the bad, then you are going to have a much, much better time because inherently, then when something bad comes along, you're like, oh, okay, it's just time to do the hard shit right now. And then when something good comes along, you also appreciate it more, right? You're like, okay, now it's time to like climb back up to the top of the wheel. And when we look at a birth chart, everyone's baseline experiences of fate are going to be different, right? Some people, like we talked about in the very beginning, are going to be born into more privileged circumstances. So they're kind of downswing of fate might not be as harsh as someone else's, at least in a very specific material circumstance kind of way, right? But everyone experiences difficulties. You might have all the money in the world and never find someone that you love or like want to be with, right? That relationship part of your life might not be as supported and resourced and uplifting and happy as the material financial circumstances are. And that's what we see in a birth chart, right? We can identify areas that are going to go better for a person and are going to be subjectively more challenging. And I think when you feel into that, that's a relief on some level, right? Because all of a sudden we can say, oh, like maybe that's just not my lot in this lifetime. And I think about that kind of concept all of the time. And I say it all of the time too. When something goes wrong, with my health, for example, I'm just like, oh, I just didn't get the health card in this lifetime, right? I got a lot of other cards that are great and wonderful. I've got an amazing career that I absolutely love. I get to do my passion every day. I've got a beautiful relationship. I got those cards. I didn't get the health one. That's, we can't win in every area of life. And I've developed some acceptance around that instead of starting to think like, well, what's wrong with me? Why aren't I doing better? Why can't I improve this more? Right. And it's because on a baseline, my chart says health stuff is going to be harder for you. And it is, and that's not to diminish the suffering that we all experience by any stretch of the imagination. Because believe me, when I couldn't walk for a month because my back was so messed up, I wasn't sitting there like, oh, this is great. Like there will be a turn of the wheel and I'll feel better again someday. But I was able to sit there and be like, I can see how this is showing up astrologically. I know it's not going to be this bad forever. And also, this is part of it. This is part of my fate. This is part of my allotment, right? And this concept of someone's allotment is one of the oldest philosophical principles that we have. If we think back to Plato's Republic and the myth of in particular, they tell this story of how there are all of these souls who are waiting to incarnate and they're kind of sitting around. And then you have the triple fates. You have Lachesis, Clotho, and Apollos, and they are the ones who are going to determine the fate. But there is still an element of choice here, which is interesting because the way that this works, or the way that this idea is presented anyway in Plato, is that they cast out these lots. And each lot kind of has a number on it. You pick the lot that falls closest to you, and then you go in order to choose the life that you want to live. And what's interesting about that is that some people make the choice really quickly, right? They're like, oh, I can be a king in this lifetime. So I'm just gonna choose that. But they don't take the time to like read the whole story and realize that to become king, they're gonna have to kill their father or something, right? So there's kind of just this innate feeling of like, oh, that's good. That's where I want to go. And then other people are like, oh, I kind of want to live a calmer life. I want to be a farmer, right? And they don't realize everything that comes along with that, right? One of these goes back to Odysseus, who was one of the, if you've ever read the Odyssey, it's about Odysseus. And it's his journey of he was a farmer, and then all of a sudden he goes to war and he is fighting at Troy for whatever 10 plus years, tries to go home, and then is also delayed on his course and goes through this massive adventure and then has these epics written about him. And he thought he was just going in to be a farmer. Right. So there's this kind of element of fate and free will at play even before we incarnate, according to Plato and according to this myth. And so there's this element of I can choose the life that I want to live, but you're not necessarily going to know everything that is going to happen in order for that life to truly manifest. And in this process of choosing your life, choosing your allotment, you also get assigned a daimon, which is like a tutelary spirit, a guiding spirit that is going to help ensure that you live out your fate. So there's also spiritual support to ensure that you are able to fulfill your destiny, right? And that concept of destiny seems to be something that we are a lot more comfortable with because it has positive connotations. It's like, oh, it's my destiny to do this. And all of a sudden, that sounds really exciting. It's my destiny to become an astrologer. It's my destiny to have a child. It's my destiny to travel the world, right? But when we think about, oh, it's your fate to do those things, it immediately kind of takes on this feeling of, oh, I don't have choice. Oh, I don't have control. And that becomes thought of a little bit more negatively. And if we could just say, oh, destiny and fate are kind of two things that are different words, have slightly different connotations, but kind of mean the exact same thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, why can't it be your fate to experience something wonderful and beautiful? Why wasn't it fated for you to meet your partner exactly when you did, right? Meeting anybody, I think, is kind of fate at work because what are the odds out of whatever, 7, 8 billion people on this planet that you met that person, you happen to be in the same place at the same time. And by this chance encounter, all of a sudden they become an important person in your life. That's fate, right? You running into your friend when you're out and about in the city, that's fate, right? These chance encounters, these opportunities that present themselves, both good and bad, are fated. And astrology reflects that time and time again through pretty much everything, right? Through the baseline understanding of a natal chart, but also through timing techniques like transits, right? We can say, like, oh, well, Jupiter is going to conjoin my Venus. So I'm most likely going to experience XYZ, right? Usually something pretty good because Venus and Jupiter are what we call the benefics, which translates literally to good doer, right? Jupiter is planet of abundance and wealth and success and faith and hope and optimism, and Venus is relationships and creativity and love and joy. So those two planets coming together, we might say, oh, that's going to be a really good time for you, right? And I'm fated to experience something more beneficial when that happens. That's fate. You know, the transit is telling you you're going to experience something. And then when it plays out and you do experience that, that was fated to happen. If you look at other timing techniques, this comes through as well. You know, if you're looking at things like as complicated as zodiacal releasing, for example, which I will try not to go on a whole tangent about zodiacal releasing. But if you aren't aware of what this timing technique is, you've never heard of it before, it is essentially a way to divide up your life into chapters of a book, and you can get really, really specific. You can go from, oh, this, 30-year period all the way down to seconds. And when you start looking at that, it's kind of like, am am I fated to experience everything, every thought, every action, every idea that you have that is you believe is coming from you through your own volition? We can see that through zodiacal releasing because we have different lots for different things. And that's what we release from. That is like where it comes from, right? That is a releasing of the zodiac from the perspective of the lots most commonly. So the two lots that most people know about are the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit. The lot of fortune really is the fated stuff, right? These things that you have no volition over, no control over. It talks about health, it talks about money, it talks about these kind of ebbs and flows of fate and fortune. And the lot of spirit is of the soul. It is most closely linked with that concept of the daimon that we find in Plato's myth of where it's like, what is the daimon guiding you towards? It's associated with your general life direction, the things that you do from your own volition. And we can time that down to the second. So if you can do that, then do we have any free will at all? I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish this was an answerable question, but it's kind of fun that it's not. 'Cause I'm going to spend my entire life thinking about it, and maybe now you will too. Can really go, one way and cause a little bit of an existential crisis at first. I have a lecture on zodiacal releasing, and it's one of the first things I say. I'm like, if you are not ready to have your entire worldview kind of blow up in front of your face right now, probably best to put this down and circle back when you feel ready for that. It's also something my teacher, Chris Brennan, says in his zodiacal releasing lecture. And that I was like, ah, bring it on. And then I'm sitting there, after listening to this 18-hour lecture, just like, wow, everything is fated. And it changed my entire life. It changed the entire way that I view things. And if we can time down the things that you do of your own volition, right, to the second, then it kind of pulls into question, is there any free will at all? Right. And then we can kind of go far on the other side of this, where it's like, well, if everything is fated, then I just won't do anything. Right. I hear this all the time. It's like, well, if everything's fated, then I'll just sit on the couch forever. And my answer to that is always try, give it a week, See what happens, right? Give it a month if you're still kind of kicking after a week on the couch. You are gonna get restless. You're gonna get itchy. You're gonna feel like you gotta go do something, right? And whatever that something is usually your purpose. It's usually your lot of spirit thing. So the thing that makes you want to get up off the couch, right? Because inherently, if you're not fated to do nothing, you're not going to do nothing. So if you are fated or destined to be a writer, then when you are sitting there on the couch doing like the Netflix thing for a week, you're going to get bored and your mind's going to start ideating and thinking of like, oh, what's the next thing I could write about? And eventually you're like, yeah, I'll just grab my laptop or I'll grab a pen and paper and I'll just start putting some ideas down, right? And then you're going to come out of it and you're going to have whatever the next written piece of work is for you. And this is the case for pretty much everybody, everyone that I've talked to. And I've talked to a lot of people about their lot of fortune and their lot of spirit. And so we come up against this idea, well, it's like, okay, then if everything's fated, I just won't do anything. And that's not really what you're fated to do. So you're not going to do that, you know? And I don't think it's helpful to go fully into this deterministic worldview that does kind of operate on that basis of like, then I'll do nothing, because we kind of have this illusion of free will. And even if it is just an illusion, it's also what enables us to keep going, to keep getting off the couch, right? And so I don't think it's wholly good to go all the way to the deterministic side. And I do think that we have some level of free will. How much? I have no clue. I go back and forth all the time between thinking every single thing in life is fated, which is probably the most extreme that you could possibly get, to going, like, yeah, we have these certain things that we're meant to experience, and we're born into certain circumstances that influence our ways of moving through the world, and the things that we are more likely or inclined to experience. But we've got some wiggle room, right? And how much wiggle room is where I go back and forth a lot. And I feel like it's one of those things that everyone has different opinions on. And I've had a couple people ask me, where do I fall on the spectrum? How deterministic am I? And I think it's just one of those things where I feel like most things are fated. I think because of my engagement with certain techniques, like zodiacal releasing, for example, it's very hard for me to see stuff like that and to not go, kind of all of this is meant to be, right? At a certain time for a certain reason, even if I don't know why that is. I was talking to another astrologer recently, and when you are doing zodiacal releasing, most people look at levels 1 through 4. And level 1, like I was saying, it can span anywhere from like 8 to 30 years. You go down to the level 4, you're kind of working with a matter of days, and then if you want to, there's been additional functionality added to this technique on AstroSeek. I asked the creator of AstroSeek to add in level 5s so we could see what's happening in those kind of more minor chunks of time. And he went all the way to level 8. And not a lot of people have experimented with this. I have. And then this other astrologer I was talking to has. And he was telling me, he's like, one day I decided to just track all the way up to my level 8 for a whole day just to see what happens. And every time I had a third house activation, right? The sign on the third house was activated on the level 8. The third house is related to siblings. This person's sibling would walk in the room and be like, hey, da 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 da. And they would have a conversation. And then they would leave the room as the period would shift. And it's just one of those things where they were like, I kind of had to put it down after that because I got a little freaked out. And I had a very similar experience when I started looking at these very minor levels of cycle releasing, where I was like, what happens, right? When I get a peak period, let's say, which is kind of like a increase in action, more cosmic momentum, spurring you to do something, right? It'd be like I'd be laying in bed and then all of a sudden I'd hit one of these peak periods. I'm like, oh, I guess I got to go make myself breakfast or like get up and go make myself a smoothie or something. And I could see that these activations were timing even the most minute things in my life, things that nobody needs to be tracking to this level, right? But that I was just curious, does it work down to the minute, right? Does it work? And it does. And if this is freaking you out, it kind of should freak you out. Because it's freaky. What do you mean everything I do is fated, right? But we can't get around this. And I think, like I was saying before, it's still good to kind of maintain that illusion of free will or the illusion of agency because it's just easier to operate that way in the day to day. And quite honestly, we're still here. we're still human beings living a life on this planet, and it is not realistic to try to track your fate to that degree. Sometimes it's like, what helpfulness is that, or what utility does that have, right? Do you need to know when you're going to get up to go make lunch every day? Like, not really, right? Or not ever, honestly. But the fact that it works says a lot about the nature of reality. And that can be kind of mind bending when you feel into it. And so when people ask me, I'm like, well, I kind of feel like most things are fated, most things are predetermined. But my general belief is more that those big life events are the ones that are fated. And how we get from point A to point B is a little bit more loose. Let's say point A is birth, point B is your parents divorcing. We'll use my life. Right. So my parents divorced when I was quite young. I think those are things that are fated to happen, right? Those are major life events, the ones that are going to completely impact my reality, right? Now I'm living in two different homes, for example. Right. It's a total reorientation to my idea of mom and dad or what have you. And so how I get from point A to point B, a little bit more wiggle room in between those things, right? But if they're meant to get divorced or whatever the next event is meant to happen, you're going to arrive at that point regardless, right? How you get there isn't always going to be as important. But like I said, you can still kind of time that stuff down to the minute. So, you know, this is where I go back and forth, and I have this debate in my head all of the time. I think most practitioners of astrology fall a little bit more in the middle. Like some things are fated and some things are not. Some things we have total control and agency over, and some things we just don't, right? Like those big life events, for example, getting married, having a kid, moving abroad, all of those things, right? Being more of the fated things, the ones that are in our birth chart that we can look at and point out and be like, oh, this person has, a ninth house stellium. So they're fated to travel extensively or to go to university, right? We can kind of look at those on a baseline condition because the ninth house is associated with travel and with learning, higher education that we take on of our own volition, supposedly. And so you might see that in the chart and be like, oh, you're inclined to do that. So you're fated to experience these things. That's where the threads of fate are going to pull you, right? But then most practitioners, I think, come into it with, and what you choose to study or, where you choose to go, those things are a little bit more open to your agency, to your free will. I don't know. I don't think so, kind of. I think we're kind of meant to be in certain places at certain times because those things impact the rest of our fate. If you study abroad, let's say in France versus in Spain versus in Poland versus in Asia, right, you're going to have entirely different experiences because you're in different cultures, there's different languages, there's different people, there's different customs, and all of those things are going to impact your experience there and especially impact whether you want to maybe stay after that, whether you want to continue your education, right? What kind of teachers you have access to. So in that context, it's like, well, is it really free will? Probably not. But I think the problem is that we just don't want to give up control, right? We want to believe that we're solely responsible for our successes. And where do we land with this with like failures and challenges, right? Like it's not your fault if something bad happens, like I was saying before, but people want to be wholly in charge of the wins, right? It's like, well, I did that. That didn't just happen to me by fate's hand, right? That wasn't just given to me. I worked for that, right? And I feel like there's a little bit of like a capitalist mindset in here of like, well, I am producing and I am productive and I am climbing the ladder, and that is a a virtue, right? That is something that is inborn. That's something I am doing from my own agency. I'm choosing to be a hard worker. But the single mom of three who is working three jobs to put food on the table is not necessarily working harder than like someone like Jeff Bezos. Or sorry, other way around. Is definitely working harder than someone like Jeff Bezos, right? But the success, the outcome, is it her fault that she's not a billionaire? She's probably putting in more hours than he is, right? No. Some of those things are just fate and circumstance, being born into certain conditions, having certain things happen to you that you cannot control, right? One isn't more entitled to it than the other, right? And I think when we kind of tease that apart, it makes a lot of sense. And it just removes that obligation of us to that it's our fault, right? Like it's not your fault that you're in poverty. It's not your fault that your health sucks. It's not your fault that you and your siblings don't get along. It's not your fault that you haven't met the love of your life yet, right? Maybe it's just not time, or maybe that's not part of your fate pattern, right? And the more that we can develop acceptance around that, the more free I think we are to go and chase the things that do bring us joy, and to maybe try to engage with the areas of our lives that are kind of more inclined to bring us happiness, bring us success, bring us elevation, bring us those beautiful, joyful relationships and experiences, rather than constantly kind of banging our head against the wall because this one path isn't working, right? When in reality, it's just like, maybe that's not the path for you. That's okay. That's okay. And so I think it just removes personal responsibility for all difficulties, which is liberating. And that's not to say that, oh, nothing that you do is bad, right? Because it kind of it gets all faded. That's another way that we can go too far in one direction. But I do think it's helpful for kind of thinking that like it's not all our fault, all of the time. But there are a lot of those astrological techniques that talk about fate, right? Like we mentioned a few of them, like zodiacal releasing, for example, where we can kind of predict someone's agency, but also any timing technique, transits, secondary progressions, Ferdaria, decennials, anything that tells you this planet is going to become more important at this time, or this house is going to get activated, this sign is going to get activated. That is telling you that you are more inclined to experience something during a given year of life because that is the case, right? And we see this all the time, right? Someone's in a fourth house perfection year and then they move, right? Because the fourth house is related to your home and family. And all of a sudden, those topics are becoming more activated, more important during a given year of life for you. And all of a sudden, you move, right? You do the fourth house thing, or you renovate your house, or you reconnect with your father, or, right? And there's so many different ways that these kind of symbols can play out. And that is the job of the astrologer. That is the craft of astrology, to try to figure out what it is, right? We're doing our best we can with a whole lot of data. We're inherently going to be wrong sometimes because you are trying to encapsulate the entire possibility, the entire breadth of human experience into, you know, 7 planets if you're using the traditional, 10 if you're not, some lots if you use lots, 12 houses, 12 signs, right? And so if you're trying to do that, there's always going to be a myriad ways that something could play out. And we're just doing the best we can to figure out what those are. But any timing technique, anything in astrology is going to automatically speak to fate with a capital F, in particular, the lot of fortune. And if you want more on the Lot of Fortune, I did like a 4-hour episode with Chris Brennan on the Astrology podcast about that. So go check that out. We talk about it a lot. But I think ultimately what I want to get to with this is that accepting your fate is probably one of the best things you can do in this lifetime to be happy, or to at least be content, right? And there is this phrase, Amor Fati, love your fate, right? I always joke that it's like the millennial tagline. It's in everyone's bios, right? Amor Fati. And my thing is like Amor Fati or whatever. You know what I mean? Like love your fate or don't, but accept it, right? Because the closer that you get to acceptance, the closer you're going to get to having a little bit less emotional and internal turbulence when things either go wrong or when they go right. It teaches you to appreciate the beautiful moments and the opportunities and experiences that befall you. And it also teaches you not to fear the ones that are going to be a little bit more challenging, because it's just the turn of the wheel, right? And the wheel is always turning. There's going to be an upswing, there's going to be a downswing, right? And the more that we can kind of make peace with that, the more we can make peace with life. So I really do think it can kind of just deepen our acceptance of the ebbs and flows and kind of release that expectation on ourselves to always be at the top of our game. And I had some people ask questions about fate. Like I had a little question box on Instagram quite a while ago where I said, I'm doing something on fate. What do you want to know about it? What are your questions about it? And there were two that came up more than any other. One of them was, is death predetermined, and what is predetermined? And the other one was, can you change your fate? So, in terms of is death predetermined, I believe it is. I believe that birth, death, major life events, like I was saying before, those are all fated. And if you think about this from the lens of Plato or the Republic or even just Greek mythology, right? You had the triple fates, the Moirai, they were called sometimes, and they were the three sisters. And there's this quote that says Atropos was one of the three fates and was known as, quote, the inflexible one. It was she who chose the manner of death and ended the life of mortals by cutting their threads. She worked alongside her two sisters, Clotho, who spun the thread, and Lachesis, who measured the length, right? So we have a role, a guardian of death, of our personal death. And I think it kind of ties back in with this whole concept of the threads of fate that weave throughout our lives. At some point, our thread runs out, it's cut, and our role and our part to play and our experience of life. It ends, at least in some context, right? And Atropos was the one who was responsible for that. So we can see this is kind of built into the framework of at least kind of Greek thought, right? She was thought to be, the Moirai, the triple fates were thought to be more powerful than Zeus, who was the king of all of the gods, right? So it was like even he couldn't escape what they wanted to do. And that really says that fate is all powerful, right? We cannot escape our fate. We can't outrun our fate. I say this to clients all the time. I'm like, you can choose, you can fight your fate, but it's going to be a whole lot easier if you don't fight your fate and go kicking and screaming against your will, but kind of submit and say, okay, you know what? This just might be the swing of fortune right now. That's okay. All of a sudden, we might not be able to control what's happening, but we can, to some degree, control our response to it, right? Or try to adjust our attitude towards it. Maybe that's fated too. Right? Maybe it's all just fated. But I think that, yeah, death, I do think is predetermined. And we can see this, in astrology, right? Like you can see this with transits. You can see people have like really significant zodiacal releasing periods when they die. And you can also see that life isn't really over when someone dies because zodiacal releasing, for example, transits, they're still active even after someone is no longer here. There's a lot of really interesting examples with this. And you can see how when someone gets famous posthumously, for example, they usually have like really profound transits to like their career house and their chart. Or in zodiacal releasing, they enter, a major peak period ruled by their benefic of sect or something like that. And all of a sudden coincides with them becoming more eminent, right? So our lives are not necessarily over when they're over, right? Our impact lives on. And I think it's really fascinating that we can see that through astrology and through these different timing techniques and stuff like that. So I do believe that those types of things are definitely predetermined. And then the other question of changing your fate and can you change your fate, right? And what can you do to change your fate? This is where my biggest question mark lies. I'm never going to lie to you guys and be like, I've got it all figured out. Like that would be wild of me to sit here and be like, I have all the answers because I absolutely do not. I'm just someone who spends a lot of time thinking about this and has a lot of empirical data supporting the fact that fate is an ever present force in our lives. But the two things that I come up against with this is electional astrology and magic. Now, electional astrology is the practice of picking a auspicious moment to begin an action with the idea that you can have a more favorable outcome if you choose to do it at a quote unquote good time, right? So there's all of these different principles that go into electional astrology and what constitutes a good chart, right? And what constitutes a good chart for a specific person that I'm not going to go into. I have a whole course on it if that's interesting to you. But it's this notion of jumping into the driver's seat with fate, right? It's kind of saying, well, maybe I know better. Maybe actually I'm going to choose to do this at this time because this is the outcome that I want for this thing, right? Like this podcast is elected for me. Obviously, most things in my life are elected if I have the ability to elect. A little bit less with a child now, but when I can, I do. And that is me trying to say like, okay, like I want this thing to go this way. So I'm going to do this at this time. I'm going to record this episode at this time. I'm going to release the podcast on this date because this is how I want it to go. Right. And I think about how that is kind of stepping into the driver's seat with fate and saying, all right, let's do this together, right? You are still always constrained by where the planets are in the sky. You don't get to pick and choose. You can't move one here and move one there. Any good electional astrologer is going to tell you there is no such thing as a perfect chart. The universe operates on a system of checks and balances. And that is so true when you look at electional astrology, because in every chart, there might be 10 things about it that are absolutely amazing and two things about it that you're like, ah, this would be the perfect chart if those things weren't there, right? But we cannot take the malefics out of the sky. We can't delete Mars and Saturn from our software, or you can, and just, ignorance is bliss, I guess. But you're still going to be subject to experiencing them, right? And I say Mars and Saturn just because those are the malefic planets, or the ones that are more capable of producing challenging circumstances. They're always going to manifest in harsh ways, but way more often than the benefics, way more often than Venus and Jupiter they are. So just as like a baseline, you know, so you're still kind of at the whim of the planets, right? You're still operating within the confines of fate and circumstance because of that, right? You might be able to capture Jupiter in Cancer, right? That's a chance that only happens one every 12 years, and Jupiter's exalted in Cancer. So it's this beautiful thing, right? It's like, oh, the planet of abundance and good luck and hope and faith and all of these things is now in a sign where they do really, really well. Well, you might have to wait 12 years to get that transit, right? So you're still kind of subject to where the planets are in the sky at any given moment, but you have an ability by acting at a certain time, by choosing to initiate something at a certain time, to steer the outcome of that into a direction that is more aligned with your goals and desires. So that is one of the things that I think we can do to change our fate. However, I don't think you can out elect your natal chart. If something in the birth chart says you're not meant to experience this, right, then you're not meant to experience that. And no election is going to get you there, you know? So then I get back to this idea of like, well, yeah, are we just fated to elect, right? Are you fated to learn electional astrology so that way you can kind of have the outcomes of certain events align more with your will? Maybe, so I'm always kind of entertaining both possibilities. I'm a Gemini rising, so I'm always going back and forth between these things of electional astrology helps us change our fate. And then, oh, actually, maybe it doesn't. And maybe it's just part of our fate, right? It's the time that tells us like, oh, this is the time to do the thing. So we do the thing. And maybe we needed that because we wouldn't have done it otherwise, right? I know that's very true for me, at least. Launches, like anything. I would sit around for so long if there wasn't an election that I was trying to capture, and I can't miss that date. So I'm like, I have to get it done by this date, right? Which is usually a time that aligns with something better in the sky for me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be picking it. And then, if something's go well, then, well, there you go. You chose that, right? And sometimes you just can't out elect, certain things that you're not supposed to experience in this lifetime. You're not fated to experience. So, can you change your fate with electional astrology? Maybe. I think it gives you a leg up, at least, right? It helps you roll double sixes more frequently, but it doesn't mean that you're never going to roll snake eyes or what have you. Now, magic, right? People tend to feel all types of ways about magic. I'm not here to tell anyone what to believe. My recommendation is always try it for yourself or don't. If it doesn't sound interesting to you, if it's so far out of your worldview that you're like, you're crazy, that's cool. I'm not judging you. Don't judge me. But magic is one of the ways I think that we can probably change our fate the most, right? Because you are inherently like then going almost to the master weaver and saying like, I want more of this type of experience, right? So with astrological magic, for example, if you're not familiar with the concept of astrological magic, it is essentially using astrology to pick certain times to do a magical ritual or to propitiate a deity or something like that to say, this is what I want to experience, help me experience this thing, right? Like I'm broke, I need money. Go to Jupiter when Jupiter is strong in the sky and do a ritual. And then, you have an ability to experience more Jupiter things, which might allow you to change your fate in some context. I think this more than electional astrology, I tend to think is less fated, right? Because magic is inherently unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen when you get a talisman or something like that because you are interfacing with spirit, power, the universe in a way that goes so far beyond you, right? That you just simply can't can't know what exactly it's going to do. Like you might, make a talisman on this day with Jupiter in Cancer. I keep saying Jupiter in Cancer just because we're coming up on Jupiter in Cancer and it's top of mind for me. Where I really want this Jupiter thing, right? Honors and riches, and that's health, right? Jupiter's kind of like a good catch-all for everything. So usually people really like Jupiter talismans. And all of a sudden, say you have, Jupiter energy in your chart that isn't as strong, then if you do that, you might get some more Jupiter because you were kind of going above, I think, like the realm of your birth chart. But then I come back to this idea of like, well, if Zeus answered to the fates, then does magic change anything at all? I don't know. Are we fated to do magic to experience certain results that we think are unpredictable, but we're actually meant to experience the entire time? Maybe, maybe. And so, can you change your fate? My answer is I don't know. Sorry, super unsatisfactory answer. But I think that just kicked my table a little bit. But electional astrology and magic are the closest that we can get, and at least can make you a little bit more aware of how taking action or doing something at a certain time is going to align you with certain outcomes versus kind of going at it blind. Even more so than just being aware of transits, right? Because you might know, like, oh, Mercury's gonna conjoin my midheaven soon. So I might have like an opportunity to be, put my ideas out into the world a little bit more. It's a very kind of baseline delineation for that transit. But you're not saying, okay, on this date, at this time, when Mercury conjoins my midheaven and the moon is in the sign aspecting Mercury, I am going to start a social media account to put my ideas out there, right? You're not jumping into the state of agency. You're kind of allowing fate to play out and you're observing it, but you're not necessarily being an active participant. And I think being an active participant is where we start moving into, can you change it? You get closer to that, right? At least within the context of like what even can be changed or modified. Because now all of a sudden it is not necessarily wholly about you. It's about the seasonality of that moment, right? It's like this moment is auspicious. So I'm going to do this thing at this time to get this outcome. And then you are more likely to experience the outcome that you want rather than seeing what happens, kind of. So you're moving from a passive place to an active place when you do things like electional astrology and magic. And I think that is as close as we can get to changing our fate. And is that even changing our fate? I don't know. But that's kind of where I land with all of that. And ultimately, I think the beautiful thing about fate is that we are all fated to interact with one another at certain times. We're fated to meet certain people. I think of the universe as almost this beautiful cosmic tapestry, and we all have our individual threads of fate that coalesce and come together, and they paint this story, right? The story of human existence. And our individual threads of fate, they might feel individual, but they are part of a greater collective story and narrative that's happening. And our fate influences another's fate and is bound together with another person's fate, right? Like you might meet someone and you get into a relationship and you both have your individual threads of fate and then they start weaving together because one person's decisions and actions influence the other. And then, oh, you have a child. And now we have three threads of fate. It's hard to say. I could not say that 5 times fast. Now you have three threads of fate that are weaving together, right? And those are threads of fate that are born from your individual parents and their circumstances, right? And you can see how then you add in friendships and you add in bosses and you add in any type of relationship with a human being, with a spirit, with a deity, whatever it might be, right? Your threads of fate start becoming so tightly entwined with one another. They almost are inseparable. And I think it's this really beautiful metaphor for how, not even a metaphor, just it is, right? That we are all connected and that my actions influence another person, which influence another person, and can kind of ripple out and cause a collective impact. So when you come back to this place of, well, what can I do, right? Who's just one person? Your single thread of fate might have the ability to change the world, to change all of the people's lives around you. And that might be your destiny. And you might just be a part of the greater cosmic tapestry that we are all a part of. You certainly are. And that to me is why I think fate is a beautiful thing and not something to be feared, but something to be accepted, something that we should make friends with, and ultimately use it as a way to develop greater acceptance for the ebbs and flows of our lives that we all experience. Because even if it's a hard time for you, your thread of fate might have to be woven that way to influence another person's thread of fate, to influence their thread of fate that goes on to ripple out into the collective, like I said before. So that's why this podcast is titled Threads of Fate, because I think our threads of fate are shown through astrology. Both our individual story and the greater collective story is shown through astrology. We can experience it through divination. We can experience it in so many different ways. And that's what I want to explore in this podcast. I want to talk about how we can gain a greater understanding of our threads of fate, how we can gain greater acceptance over our threads of fate, even when they are harsh or challenging, and especially when they're beautiful and supportive. And that is why I'm here doing this now at this time with you. So I hope this gave you a little bit of context for why the show is named what it is, my beliefs around fate. I hope it just gets your brain going in general around the concept of fate. Hopefully, gives you a little bit more of a soft heart towards the concept instead of maybe aversion, right? And that we can just slowly move into a place of acceptance with it and live more harmonious, happy lives as a result. So, that is going to be the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to go deeper into your own threads of fate, like I said, I have that course on electional astrology. If you want to change your fate, I have a lecture on zodiacal releasing. If that kind of timing technique sounded interesting to you, I've got that podcast episode with Chris Brennan on the Lot of Fortune, but I also have a lecture on my site about all of the Hermetic lots: fortune, spirit, courage, eros, necessity, victory, and nemesis. So there's a lot of different offerings on my site that you can check out if you want to go deeper with my work. And if you are enjoying the podcast, then go ahead and like this video, rate us 5 stars. It really, really helps me grow, and I would be so grateful. Our next episode is going to be the beginning of a really, really amazing series with an astrologer who I absolutely love and respect and am just thrilled to be working with. So make sure you tune in next Tuesday for that episode, and I will see you then. Bye.